Hello, everybody. Today's August 9th, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me as a guest Mark Changizi. Mark, tell us about yourself and your interests and what your journey has been.
Hey there. Great to be here. Well, I'm a scientist, sort of a mathematician, physics kind of guy. I became a cognitive scientist, written on my sixth book that just came out last year on many aspects of perception, why we, emotion, how we came to have music, lots of very different kinds of things, but that I approach it from a very mathematical, rigorous kinds of ways. So I sort of became a well-known cognitive scientist with a number of kind of well-known fun discoveries. And then, and I was always trying to remain apolitical. I'm not really I would talk about free expression over the last 10, 15 years here and there, but I'm not the kind of guy I'm a libertarian, classical liberal. I didn't really want to get into this whole constant left-right stuff. But then COVID happened, and, March 10, I was like, this is crazy. And I started tweeting about how this is kind of a crazy collective hysteria, which I didn't really know anything about. And I don't think really very many people know about it. The sorts of people that study collective hysteria are historically these psychiatrists, psychologists who are not really part of the mathematical world where you study emergent phenomena, complex systems to really even sort of understand these kinds of phenomena. So I, became then an outspoken anti-lockdowner, anti-masker, and sort of been agitating about this, and then pushing against the censorship by the federal government. It was the first lawsuit against the federal government, the Changizi versus the Department of Health and Human Services. Now the Missouri case from the district attorneys has now gone farther than ours. They came afterwards with much more released data that they had, documents than we had. We're now under appeal. So I'm now really completely steeped in the world of fighting for freedom that COVID and COVID hysteria thrust upon us. So now I'm kind of known in the past through, I would have TV shows, sort of head games. I was the regular scientist on brain games here and there. And had a lot, I've written for hundreds of magazines and science, science articles in lots of magazines. So covered for my science side, but now all of the videos that I do and all the blogs and sort of, this kind of thing, and they're all COVID related, and by very generally COVID kind of politics related. So that's sort of the second stage. Maybe it'll turn out in my life with sort of two themes, sort of the pre-political and now a grudgingly political part of my life. Yeah.
So how has that played out for you on, say, a personal, professional basis? What's your day job, and has that been affected? And do the books carry you and all these other appearances and so forth?
Yeah, so I'm a theorist, and I was in psychology departments, cognitive science departments, neuroscience departments, computer science departments, in various different places. But I had decided at some point, my last job in proper academia was at Caltech, and then I went to RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and I was in the cognitive science department, and I was like, the other folks are all experimentalists. Everybody's experimentalist, and I'm a theorist. There's not very many theorists in the field. But in order to get a grant, I've got to compete with all of these experimentalists who are really bright and really good at experimentation. And experimental work is really subtle, and they're brilliant. They're brilliant folks. But why should I? I don't need to compete with them to do my theory. I just need a pencil and occasionally, algorithms, programs that I'm writing. So I said, this is crazy. This is just pushing me to do grants, to do bullshit that I don't even want to do. And I'm not good at that. I'm good at this stuff, not the stuff that they're good at. So I eventually, in 2010, I left proper academia and started my own research institute with a colleague, 2AI Labs, and then started companies that came out of my research. Vino Optics, we sell vein finder glasses and color blindness glasses that comes out of one of my discoveries on why we evolved color vision. So I've been an academic. I've written 3 or 4 books. Four of my 6 books have happened since I've left proper academia. The last one, Expressly Human, last year, which was censored, by the way, another whole story. But I've done that outside of academia. So the question is, would I have been the strong anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-government critic if I had been sitting in academia and all my colleagues all thought the same way? And I was already a libertarian in that world where 97% are far left. So I was already at least holding that despite my surroundings. But, I wouldn't be able to get grants again, right? If I started to speak out and talk crap like I was doing, and I wouldn't be able to get covered by the media. And in fact, I was invited all the time for keynotes for the last, 15, 20 years. Haven't been invited to many keynotes. haven't been covered in, none of my new book. My old, research was covered in New York Times many times, and all of it, Scientific American over and over again, all over the place covered. This last book, just crickets. No one wanted to cover it. No journalists. Journalists would actually tweet in 2020, we need an app that ensures that if we're ever in a bookstore and we see a book by Mark Changizi, it says, do not buy, because he's a denier, right? So I certainly have been hurt in these senses. Wired magazine wanted to do like a kind of a video shoot with me where I'm covering other kinds of things, and they kind of a fun thing. And they said, all you have to do is just sign that you're vaccinated. This was in late 2022, right? And I said, no, I'm not vaccinated, and if it's hinging on this, then just count me out. So they counted me out. So my book, 10 Years in the Making, Expressly Human, which is sort of Darwin asked the question, why do social animals have emotional expressions? For 10 years, my colleague and I have been working on this new grain unifying theory. Why do we have emotional expressions? What are they for? How does it work? And in fact, it also serves as the foundation for free expression itself. But ironically, when it came out in 2022, I was being censored by the Biden administration, along many thousands of specific individuals, as well as many billions of specific messages being propagated on social media. So that book didn't get covered basically anywhere. Right? It was because, and I couldn't speak because I was being censored in all the social media. My videos taken down on YouTube. My tweets I was labeled sensitive content, like a porn star, but without the benefits. And Facebook and Instagram was actually the least censorial, despite it being owned by Meta. I can't quite explain, but they still are censorial, but somehow they were the least, I'd say, amongst those four. Anyway, so that's my story. It affected me, but this is small scale compared to the pressures that actual academics in academia and millions of people who are in jobs where they had to keep their mouth shut, they would have just lost their job altogether. And I was cut free. I was aloof on purpose. I wanted to leave academia so that I could buy my own intellectual freedom for intellectual, academic, scientific reasons. And that I think helped me. I know it helped me remain aloof and say what I really believed. But I've always been the kind of person that remains aloof because as a theorist, and I used to write about principles of being sufficiently aloof to make sure that you continue working on new ideas and new fields and don't get caught up in these little hysterias. In each field is a little minor hysteria and a little minor hysteria. And I never got, once I've made a discovery in one field, I'm not going to do another great one. I got to move on. And so what can you do to ensure that you're not the kind of person who's stuck in these little, fields where you only care about the little personalities in that field and becoming one of those great personalities in this tiny pond. And then, that by the time you're 35 and you have a little bit of gray, the 25-year-olds looking up to you and the girls are batting their eyes. It's all the stuff that any human ever wants. You don't want to do that if you want to keep aloof. And so I think that kind of aloofness for science helped me remain aloof and actually say what I wanted. But so in their ability to cancel me is highly limited, right? But they still hurt me. In my book, my sixth book, is one of my biggest discoveries. And in the long run, I think the truth will prevail. It will get out, but it definitely hurts in the short term.
No, absolutely. I'm trying to think of some parallels. I mean, this interview is not about me, but it's about you. But it's natural, I think. First of all, we have an interview format, and so we can see each other's faces. So it kind of bespeaks the potency of facial expressions. I mean, I suppose you could just have radio, kind of as a podcast. But I find it fascinating to follow people along, and I like, frankly, I like reading you, and I like reading your thoughts, and I also like reading your face as well. So I think you bring up some interesting points in your expressions book. I have not finished it, but I like the way you write. You're very clear. In my own career, I worked for myself a long period of time. I had my own medical practice, primary care and so forth, and there were times and ways in which I didn't really necessarily realize an outlier in the way things were done. I'll give you one quick example without slowing things down, I hope. I don't know if you know HRT, hormone replacement therapy for women. We live far longer than humans ever have. And menopause, it means your eggs run out and you're not really necessarily physically as desirable thereafter. You lose estrogen, which you started having in puberty until these days. And it runs out because, that's life. Men don't really go through womenopause, to make a new word up. They kind of carry on their testosterone forever. And if they're alpha guys, they can still, be somebody desirable for fertility, able women. Anyway, to cut to the chase, HRT got invented to kind of give women the veneer and the possibilities of some of the health of younger women when they hit menopause, because upon menopause they lose bone strength, and their cholesterol goes up, their heart attack rates, they start to mimic men in a lot of the health parameters, but they have a little bit of a lead time. So men have heart attacks earlier, but women without HRT, they start to kind of catch up to men in a sense. Anyway, in the early 2000s, there was Dr. Susan Love, who's a surgeon at Mass General, and she put this kind of clarion call that there was a slightly higher rate of breast cancer and or uterine cancer from women on HRT. And this was a kind of an absurdity, and mind you, it might be slightly true. Some of it was probably case finding, because women on HRT had more mammograms. They had more regular mammograms than women who don't. So some of it's case finding, but even let's stipulate there was a slight, maybe 5% increase in breast cancer and or uterine cancer. These women were getting tested more with, pap smears and mammograms, and they actually had lower mortality on HRT than without. So I kind of, I would mention this to women in order to, keep them informed of what it was and give them the option. But apparently I was like the only doctor out in the landscape, because around that time, my wife and some of her friends and whatnot, I mean, they were in their probably 40s, but, some of our older friends, whatever, they were having this issue. And all through the decades since, a lot of women hit menopause, and they could not, and they would not, and they were terrified from taking HRT. And I think it has a lot of benefits, because life, women want to be able to do similar things. And with the HRT, you don't get that widow's hump, you don't get the osteoporosis, you don't shrink. And so for my mom, for instance, when she hit 90, I'm in the 80s and whatnot, she's past us now, and God bless her, but, she shrank. She wasn't that big to begin with, and she shrank. She probably lost 3 inches. Anyway, as somebody solo, here's my point. As somebody solo, I was able to, kind of follow along and give people the God's, what I think was the truth about the matter, and let them weigh the options and then move along with their medical care. But apparently I was like the only one in the, universe of doctors in Massachusetts, in Boston, which is the, medical mecca, doing that. Now people are kind of coming around to this. It took like, a couple decades for people to say, there's probably was overblown, and you're getting mammograms, mammograms are so good, and breast cancer is not that lethal. I mean, nobody wants it anyway. So I just kind of put that story out as like a endorsement, and I don't know if it holds any interest for you, but kind of the way it's almost, you can see this, the way like a snake, big boa eats a rat. You can kind of see the rat move along the snake.
Yeah.
And this thing, HRT, has kind of moved along the snake to a point where, I mean, obviously not going to come out fully intact as a rat anymore, but you can kind of see we're reaching the almost literal tail end of this.
Yeah. As it happens, my wife is in sort of that ballpark, ages, mid-40s, and she's Iranian. She talks to Iranian friends, which are doctors all over the world, various places that they've settled, and they're all like, "Why aren't you on HRT? Or you should get on." And it's just very hard here. The doctors here are always avoidant. They don't want to do that. They're like, why on earth are these American doctors not willing to do it? But every single place else, it's the most obvious thing to do, and they're appalled that in the United States, it seems to be very hard for her to find someone willing to do that.
Yeah. So I'm glad that resonated with you a little bit. And there's a huge bug right there. I apologize. Anyway, it's there are a few things like that in medicine that just get very fad-y, faddist, and it's it's kind of weird. There's so much. I don't know. I was a chemistry and physics major, and also, like you, a BS, which at that time meant Bachelor of Science. I mean, science and BS is, I think it might have different initials connotation. A lot of it's BS. But
the only thing worse than having the kind of minor hysterias that happen in each of these fields, which we are constantly dealing with, is if the state gets involved and the state decides, or some centralized body that's recognized by the state decides that no doctor shall hereby prescribe HRT or ivermectin or whatever it might be, right?
Right.
And now you don't have, now it affixes or it freezes that little hysteria and doesn't allow the rat to continue being even digested to come out the other side, right? It's just stopped.
Even not even the hope. It's just stasis.
Right. It's just
Yeah,
stasis.
no, I think this is really a fascinating thing. I was talking with young mathematical prodigy Brian Chow, who's an interesting writer. I don't know if you've come across him yet. He's writing on AI and a lot of other topics mathematically and in a sense politically as well.
Oh, I might have. You may have friended me recently on Twitter, but I have to go check it. Yeah.
But anyway, bring up kind of like I've kind of lost my thought on that one, but some of the fattest aspects are really fascinating. So I actually would like to talk to you a little bit about some of the facial expression things, kind of get back to basics of what you're doing and how you got interested in that. I find it amazing that, absent language, we have identical facial expressions from whatever culture we're in around the world. And so if you, popped into, Papua New Guinea and couldn't speak the language or whatever, people would still have, the same kind of, grimaces and, if they eat a sour lemon, they're going to have the same face, as a baby, as an adult, from one place to another. We seem to be hardwired for this. What is the essence of that from what you could figure out, and how does it cross over into other animals as well, and in our interactions with them?
Yeah, so I mean, what we do in the book, and this is my colleague, Dr. Tim Barber. The idea is this: forget the fact that we have spoken language, right? So imagine that you don't have spoken language. So you're animals that are incredibly bright, whether you're dogs or monkeys or a lot of these kinds of social animals. They're dealing not only with the stuff of everyday life, the physical stuff that but other social creatures that are quite bright. And you need a way to run the camp, right? You need to deal with all of these kinds of interactions, which are really problematic because I want stuff and you want stuff, and we've got to figure out how to cooperate to manage all of these kinds of head-buttings that occur. And so it's generally thought in some very vague way that emotional expressions are social animals' way of dealing in some way with all of the social interactions around you. But what we did was say, look, what is it that you would actually need? What are the mathematical requirements for social animals to communicate with one another without a language and communicate somewhat honestly, so that I can say, look, I deserve, or I'm gonna get more of this zucchini bread than you, Randall, right? And I'm not freaking kidding around, right? And then you say, no, I deserve more, than you. And how can I communicate that I deserve more than you honestly? And we do these, in this case, with sort of aggressive or angry, or sort of I'm strong, pride expressions. And I might simultaneously show disdain, like you're not strong enough to deserve this, like disdain kind of thing. And I might be happy about it if you might be conciliatory and say, okay, Mark, you can have more. And then I might sort of smile, but then still have disdain and say, no, I want even more than that. Like now I'm smug, like or sneering at you. When you work out exactly the kinds of how I can commit, how I can convince you that I really deserve more, the way we do this in real life is we bet. This is just like what we do when we're playing poker. I have cards and you have cards. In this case of me arguing over zucchini bread with you, my hand might be stronger. Like, because maybe we're kids, we're brothers. Mom told me it was like 3/4 mine. You don't know that yet. But I've got a stronger hand than you, but it's in my head. Like you can't access that information. You have some hand that you think is a better hand. Same thing in poker. I'm never going to show you my hand until it's over, and you're not going to show. But what we'd like to do is see, can we come to an agreement without actually having to go ask Mom or actually show our cards? And the way that you do that in poker is what? You bet. You say, I know my hands are stronger than you. Here's the money that shows you. What we do for social animals is we have to bet reputation. We put reputation on the line. And the way that we put social reputation on the line is through our emotional expressions. The more trash talk you are with your face, either the more proud I'm looking about myself, do you know who I am, or disdainful I am about you, you're just a putz, that kind of thing. The more it's going to come back and haunt me when it turns out I'm wrong. And then you're going to mention this, and other people who are watching, and the whole tribe says Mark was the biggest douchebag. You should have seen what he said to Randall. He wasn't just wrong, but you should saw what happened for him. Right? So when you work out the mathematics of what the space of these kinds of signals needs to be to communicate these various, because it turns out there's quickly a 4-dimensional space that has to happen of all of these emotional expressions to do what you need to do. And this is what takes a book to explain. But there's 81 emotional expressions that you need to have, and they're all stuff that we know. So pride, disdain, anger, sadness, surprise, and sneer and smug, and all these different kinds of things. They all end up in their appropriate spots, and they're all the things that once you go, yeah, I get that. If I was to do this, if I was to show disdain, but after you demanded more, well, that would be disgusted. Or if I was to, each of these has these different combinations. We understand what they mean. So the language that social animals need to bet reputation or unbet. Sometimes I'm conciliatory. Oh, you're right. My bad. I forget about it. Then it's the opposite, right? The exact language that you need to be able to communicate without language and somewhat honestly through these reputation stake bets is exactly what we derive. So we're not deriving that a smile should look like this on a human face. Different animals will have different ways of signaling. That's a totally different question. We want to know what is the language itself that there have to be signals for, right? That's what it's all about. In fact, so when we speak with language, because now it's a little bit weird because we're the one animal that has a full-fledged grammatical language, right? None of the other animals do. But really when we're communicating, most of the convincing case that I'm making to you is because I'm speaking confidently, right? If I was on here going, well, I'm not really sure, Randall, maybe, I'm not really sure. Like everything that I was doing was sort of really tentative. You wouldn't believe anything I'm saying because I'm not confident about it. The way that you convey confidence is by pushing the emotions of confidence out. And then that means I'm pushing lots of reputation. Randall goes, I think Mark knows what he's talking about. Did I show you did I show you the data? And did I do a statistical t-test that shows that what I said was statistically significant? That's how we do it in science, but that's not how it works in real life. The way that we convince other people and show significance in some sense or display confidence is to actually push in social reputation and put it at stake, right? Mm-hmm. That's how we in fact do it. And everything that we're doing on Twitter, it's 10% the propositions that we're saying in natural language. Same for philosophers and arguments that are supposedly so logical. No, they're not. Most of it is all of this other stuff, pushing in thing and then carefully, really complex versions of these socio-emotional expressions, just done in different modalities, done with words or done with intonation of the voice or done with emojis and memes themselves. Actually, if you ever think about it, if you look at the memes, the GIFs, the GIF memes, they're all super emotional, right? Every single one is getting across an emotion. They're not getting across propositions, right? And they're done in immense kinds of complex ways and hilarious ways, but they're capturing the emotions so that you can really convey the emotions that it's sometimes hard to convey with text, right? But we can do it so much better in person. So the book is really both a fun, hopefully, way to get it across to people, but it really is the discovery all packaged up in a book that is an answer to this sort of age-old question about why would social animals have the emotional expressions they do and how does it work?
No, that's incredible. So I'm going to post the book cover so people can find it in a little bit. But there's really so much there. I mean, a couple of things come to mind for better or for worse. One is I think it's XBCD or whatever that cartoon was. It's a 4-panel cartoon and 2 panels, men getting together and women getting together. The men are all cursing each other out. It's like, oh, you're such a, bad word, bleep hole son of a. The other's like, oh, that's because your mother was, paid sex worker, whatever. And the women are, so that's panel number 1. Panel number 2, the women are all together, and they're like, oh my God, I love what you did with your house. Oh, it's nothing like yours. And the way you put yourself together, it's that they're all complimenting each other. And the next 2 panels, the men are all leaving. It's like, oh, that guy's so awesome. And when we're all leaving, it was like, oh, what a B word, It's like, and so the language was all there, but there's this other other stakes game going on that men and women see things differently. I mean, men I think compete on the outside, and women compete on the inside. Women compete to kind of in terms of attractiveness, appearance. Their coin of the realm is friendships, and guys are getting their coin of the realm outside, and they're I think relaxed when they're around each other, and they've already heard everything. So when they duplicate that, those are the threats that they feel that they can just like, fob off. So on the golf course, I mean, I play tennis, but I don't really, unless it's doubles, I don't really talk to somebody. On the golf course, we're all talking. And so, a guy I took out a couple of weeks ago, he hadn't played golf in forever and a half, like 25 years. And he was, not that good, but we talked him through it. He's a good athlete in general. And towards the end, we played 9 holes, like 7, 8, 9, 12. He started to hit the ball really well. And he hit someone better than me. And I said, and I wasn't even thinking. It's just like bad word, moron, son of a whatever. I was just like, I can't believe you're such a bleeping moron, And it's like, that was a compliment. It was because he had learned so quickly, and he had like overtaken the master in such a, only about an hour and a half or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was, I suppose on some level it was a threat to me because, he hit the ball better than me. And is my value? I mean, I don't know how many things go through your animal brain in an instant, but without even thinking. And I had, after I said it, I'm like, I don't see the guy that much. We don't golf that much. I'm just teasing you. I was just so, amazed by, he's like, yeah, no, I got it. But it's kind of like the words are one kind of like thing. It's maybe some, I'm not a musician, but, there's some, different staffs of music going on. Maybe that's the bass or something like that. And the actual emotion is happening somewhere else. It's the assessment of the scene, how you said it, the way you said it. And that brings up, the emojis and memes and whatnot, why we need those things. Because, obviously when we're texting and writing things down, they can be taken and interpreted 18 different ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of the things. So in that book, there's this diagram of emotional expressions. And what you'll see is one of the things that you can do is you can titrate the level of seriousness of the conversation versus the level of how relaxed you are. And so lower in this sort of diagram in the back of the book, you'll see the diagrams. They're like in a chemistry book, the periodic table, but it has the diagram. If you can just titrate, like, this is a relaxed conversation. Once it's relaxed, I can say really douchebaggy things, and almost no reputation is put at stake, right? But if suddenly, like we're at a bar talking, and suddenly I turn over and like you've scraped your chair backwards and it falls to the ground, I'm like, oh crap! Like now you've indicated that this is now you got surprised by what I said. You've taken it seriously, and so I can't say the exact same sentences I was just saying the same emotional expressions. In that context, it will mean fundamentally different things. It suddenly means I'm putting tremendous amount at stake. It means that, it's almost a fight, right? So all of these things, I can't yet explain what's going on with females in a group versus the average males group. There's obviously something different going on, but you can flesh these things out in terms of how the space of emotional expressions is used, and in turn, why they're using it that way is because they're doing different things in terms of what they're putting at stake or not choosing to put at stake.
Well, that's awesome. So that's kind of a long way from physics.
Yes and no, right? I mean, I did a science moment last week, and it only occurred to me. I was talking to my son. I said, I was trying to justify why kids in high school and college should take physics. And of course, as a physicist and someone who's done as a theorist, I'm always using physics principles. Even in here, you're able to understand when I'm arguing with you, I'm pushing you. Like if I say, well, Randall wasn't initially interested in going to the movie, but I pushed him, and I kept pushing him, and eventually he came, right? And in fact, there is a sense pushy people push, but they never physically push you, right? But you can actually start, once you understand the math of how these emotional expressions work, and you bet reputation, you're actually you're actually using energy, and you're using energy to move the minds of others. And in fact, it has all of the right units. So once, as a physicist, you can say, yeah, you're actually everything that we understand. In fact, when I push this, I'm lifting up this beer, I'm not touching any of the atoms, right? It's separated by these little forces and so forth. And so once you want to talk, if you want to explain how certain kinds of things in the world can cause movements or actions and other kinds of things in the world, it doesn't have to be just about physical objects. It could be about how minds push other minds, right? Yeah. And so, in fact, some of the same physics, and I put a lot of that into the appendices because it's not very complicated at all, but you want to keep the main part of the book just smoothly going. So some of those things are pushed off for a little bit more of the diagrams, but you have to understand physics. But actually, the point of this as an aside was that it occurred to me that one of the other reasons for physics is not just that physics is useful in all these realms, is that it only occurred to me just last week that it's not good enough when you're learning math to have lots of examples in each chapter, where you have an example about guitars, and an example about trucks, and an example about tables, and different examples about a million different things. What's important ultimately for why physics makes math stick is that physics is one big, long, extended math example. It's a huge math problem all in the same realm. So we get to learn about this and this and this and this, and then it meshes with these other concepts, and they all mesh together. Oh crap! And then you get to understand in all of these different contexts how all of these different mathematical things can really be understood together as one. So I really appreciated that. I think physics is really doubly useful for that reason. Math won't stick as something useful if you just hear lots of different examples, unless they really are in one world, so to speak.
I appreciate that. I was a chemistry and physics major, so I'm kind of like one step down the ladder from math and physics as you go down towards the real world. I have to say, you know, as I got into medical school, I kind of like went further down the ladder rung from math towards more and more diffuse sciences. You know, biology, microbiology, and then, you know, you get into these, you know, psychology, sociology, and whatnot. They're ologies, and but sometimes the scientific method could be really played with because there's so many, you know, intervening variables, and many of which can be, you know, Heisenberged, and, you know, in terms of their bias, you know, the way they affect the experiment. I'd like to maybe, you know, segue into something else a little bit. I was, you know, very much, you know, in your debt for your COVID shorts, your videos and so forth, your reels or whatever you want to call them. Maybe if you can, for our audience, recapitulate the one you mentioned, kind of about hijabs and masks. And mind you, that does kind of play. While you were talking, I was thinking about that, and I'm wondering whether you had any thoughts about the virtual or figurative as well as literal masking of society, and what that meant for expression. Since we really, you know, can do so much powerfully when we have facial expressions, or to have taken that away. I mean, I think I'm wondering whether it resonated with you because of your kind of affinity and your ability to you know, think deeply on these topics, and or, you know, kind of libertarian aspect. Anyway, so the question would be, if you can maybe kind of recapitulate some of the Sharia part and what that meant to you. What was the example you used?
I think I was using Pol Pot as an example. Is that the one where I was talking about Pol Pot?
Yeah, you mentioned hijab and Pol Pot. You said
yeah. So I mean, much of the conversation since COVID has been, and I'm certainly have my share of it on Twitter at least. I spent a lot of time arguing that no, lockdowns are in fact not going to work. That is making the utilitarian case. Lockdowns won't work. Masks won't work. The censorship is not good for society, right? A lot of these kinds of, like, it's not good for society. Now, I don't want to say that nobody should do the utilitarian argument, but I do, because I think it probably needs to be done, because you have to do all the things that you have to do to convince the other side that's being tyrannical, right? But it really does miss the point. And I'm afraid that, so suppose that someone comes up with another idea next time there's some kind of, well, with climate change. Well, it's not lockdowns, this is other thing. And it turns out it works. Like, suppose someone came up with some kind of crazy new lockdown scheme. We all do this and this, and we're all putting these little containers and hanging like into canaries and whatever, some crazy scheme.
Or a 15-minute city.
Or a 15-minute city. But it actually is an ingenious, utilitarian-wise plan in the sense that it really would work. Or new generations of masks, which when you do the following thing, you stitch them onto your face in the various ways, whatever. Maybe there's some future scheme like that would work. Well, if you spend all of your time arguing against all of the old stuff, focusing on the utilitarian arguments, it's not going to work, it's not going to work. And they say, oh, these ones work. And you're like, oh, I guess those work. And then you suddenly shift to the other argument. And what's the other argument? The other argument is that you don't have the right to force us to wear those things or do those things at all, right? If you're going to have to switch to that argument, why didn't you just have the libertarian, deontological, we say, that it's fundamentally about the rights and what they're not allowed to do to us. It's just a fundamental right, not backed by a utilitarian or welfare argument. So this would be like in Iran, with you know, the women are arguing against having to wear hijab. They say, I don't want to have to wear hijab. And they go, well, why? Well, because, and then they tried to do a utilitarian argument. instead of saying it's not your right to tell me I have to wear a hijab, they say, well, you claim that when women don't wear hijabs, men are more likely to be lustful, and that hurts society in this way, and it breaks cohesion or whatever, some kind of stuff. Well, we've done studies. We've now done all of these controlled studies and shown that in these little towns where we didn't have hijab versus, population identical and age matched towns that did have hijab, that there's no more lustfulness and cohesion of the society, whatever. All of these really complicated studies that you had to do to show that the supposed breakdown of society by the lack of hijabs, no one's going to go do that, right? And if Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, is going into the cities and telling everybody and dragging them out into the countryside to become farmers because that's the right way to live, and is the right thing at that time to say, hey, Pol Pot, I've done all of these careful, randomly controlled studies where you do take people and rip them out of their cities and put them into farms versus where you don't. And it turns out that when you do take them, rip them out and empty the cities, that, the general utility is lower, much, much, much lower with, hundreds, tens of millions of deaths, that, it's much worse. No, you don't have to do that. It's like, Pol Pot, you don't have a right to rip these people from their homes and forcibly at bayonet, march them into the farms. That's the point. And so every time that we're going around arguing that masks don't work, and again, I'm guilty. I'm not going to say that. I'm purist on this. Lockdowns don't work, and so forth. You're in some sense admitting or implicitly admitting that if they
You've already lost the argument
case, then you would do it, right? And
you've
somewhat lost the argument already.
Yeah, they begged the question, and you've taken the bait. I'll give you two examples that come to mind. One is Mao, and the other is Megyn Kelly. I like Megyn Kelly. I don't like Mao. Megyn Kelly had a show on a few months ago, and she had, top women former athletes, Olympic medalists and so forth on the show. And the question was, should these guys who are acting and thinking they're women be able to participate in women's sports? And all of them, in the case of William Thomas, who, mind you, has, from what I gather, only cut off the first three and last letter of his first name to form Leah. That's the only thing excised, apparently, was WILM. But all of them on the panel called William she. She shouldn't do this. She should have her own race. She should, with all the other women like this, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, dudesses, you've already lost your argument. You've already taken the concept, there was, Spititio Principi, you've taken this base principle and you have not argued that. You have not gone to base points. And another separate one, kind of in line with your Sharia Pol Pot argumentation, I have a book in galleys right now on narcotic de-addiction. It's called Withdraw to Freedom, How to Get Out of the Addiction Treatment Maze. And, with alcohol, just a quick example, if you're an alcoholic, no doctor's going to say, you're addicted to whiskey. I'm going to give you this clear liquid every day. 4 times a day. You take about 3 ounces of it. You're going to be fine. What's the stuff called? Vodka. We don't do vodka replacement therapy, and yet somehow for narcotic addiction we do. We say, we're going to give you buprenorphine, Suboxone, which rhymes with morphine, and it's basically a narcotic, or methadone, which is a narcotic, and we're going to give you those things. You have a disease, blah blah blah. Anyway, and we do something very different for treatment. But getting to the point here, Mao fixed all the addiction problems. He did this in the I guess early 1950s. He came to power in 1948, and by the mid 50s, there was a lot of huge opium problem. People were kind of their opium dens, and people were kind of passing out and not being useful and whatnot. And Mao fixed the problem. How did he fix it? Well, he hanged dozens, if not hundreds, and potentially thousands of narcotic dealers, opium dealers, and he imprisoned and put to work camps opiate users. He didn't give them detoxes. He didn't send them to Betty Ford or anything like that. And that solved the problem. People were terrified at the risk of death from Mao more than their worries about withdrawal from the drug. Now, so he fixed narcotic addiction. is that a useful tool? Is that the way things should be done? And people who don't want people to be on drugs or lounging around the streets high, I don't think they would go so far as to hang all the dealers. So you can get answers in society, but I think that the means don't justify the ends most of the time. Depends what you're doing, of course. Anyway, that was a little bit of a ramble.
Well, the end justify the means, I think you're trying to say, yeah.
So what's your? Do you have a next book in mind? Are you going someplace with your ideas and thoughts? And I admire you as kind of a genuine intellectual. I think the problems are out there, and really, it's not a physics mind per se; it's a mind. And if you can tackle physics, I think physics is a kind of a very useful chew toy to get your teeth sharpened or whatever the thing dogs use, some kind of reasonable bone or to get your mental thoughts sharpened. And it seems like you use them in other places. So what's your next object of tackle?
Well, at the moment, I'm, once COVID hit, my research had already finished or was near finishing the research on this emotional expression stuff that I've talked about. I had to write the book during that stage, but COVID really switched my next research direction to being about understanding kind of collective hysteria, decentralized processes, psychosocial. How do these narratives happen? How do they suddenly switch narratives? How do virtue signals really work? How all of the kinds of stuff, but treating these kinds of issues. Everybody's always thinking that, like there's someone in charge that made this happen. Bill Gates did this, Klaus Schwab did this. Rather than trying to understand it as a complex, they hold their share of responsibility, but that's not how this is happening. It's not centralized controllers that are dictating the movements at grand scales. And so what kinds of principles, how can you understand these kinds of network level human socio-political movements in a much better fashion, such that we might be able to inhibit these kinds of mass hysterias, unravel narratives, or at least redirect narratives that are not in a centrally planned way, but how can you end up with healthy measures to, and of course, free expression. If you want to understand free expression, you have to understand these large-scale network processes as well. So my free expression group, freex.group, was devoted and started in 2021, devoted to both fighting for free expression, fighting against censorship. And at the time I started, I wasn't even sure that the Biden administration was actually violating the First Amendment. But then it was clear 2 or 3 months later, by April or May of 2021, that they were. So then we've got my lawsuit against them. But really, it's even bigger than that, because what makes them so bold, what makes governments so bold to tell you that we are now working with social media to censor our opponents, is because the populace and all the journalists are demanding that they do. Every time I would turn on in late 2020, mid 2020, turn on NPR, it was another story about how YouTube isn't doing enough to stop misinformation, about Twitter's not doing enough, Facebook's not doing enough. The populace was beating as one that we have to stop people from saying anything that is a denier kind of speech, right? So that gives just that, and it's not like the president or the administration going, ha ha ha, now we have a chance. No, they bought into it as well. Like, yeah, we really have to stop it. It's this whole, everything beats it as one. But even if the president was so good, like held to his principles or his or her principles, said, no, we're not allowed to do that. We're not going to do that. It doesn't change things. It still changes things considerably. That would be much better, but it doesn't stop. Facebook would still censor, and YouTube would censor, and Google would censor, and Instagram would censor, and Twitter, and companies would cancel, and it would be defended because they're all private companies, right? If you have a populace which is intolerant, free expression doesn't exist, right? So you have to really worry. The bigger problem is, how can you have a populace that is such that it's open to free expression, so that you don't end up with these sick narratives that can't be fought against, because it's the structure of the network itself that's ill, right? And it becomes ill, and it becomes unable to fix it. And these are the kinds of things that FreeX is, that I'm trying to study with and really the Science Moment, my Science Moment series on YouTube and Rumble, my Loof Wired magazine, it's called Loof, like being aloof, but it's just called Loof Wired magazine, is really devoted trying to be, it's about being aloof in some sense, but it's about these kinds of principles and working on these ideas, talking them through in real time, whatever, week, day by day with my, the people that subscribe, as well as talking about aloof arts, is the idea that this is moving towards a next book that's sort of a really rigorous understanding of how sociopolitical movements and free expression and these sorts of things can be understood at these large scales in the context, of potentially. I didn't really want to write a book ever about the specifics of COVID. That's not my shtick. My shtick is to look for universal, general principles, grand unifying theories, and that could be one example of it. But if you notice in my book, Express the Human, I never say mask once. I don't talk about COVID once. The book is really hoping to be a standalone book that 200 years, this is the romance, right? When you're writing it, they look at Darwin's book and they go, oh, there's this guy Changizi, and he really made an important next step. And no one gives a crap about some weird COVID irrationality that happened in 2020. They're interested at that point about they're looking at the book because they're interested in emotional expressions and what they mean, right? So I want these things to be sort of timeless, and that's going to be hopefully a next book. And also, I'm also working on music again. I've got these grand unifying new ideas, which I've been talking about on my Science Moment series and a few things in Loop Wired. I've got 3 or 4 on trying to understand chord progressions and why music. I've already have one book on the origins of music. Music sounds like a human moving evocatively in your midst. That's what music is, why it's so evocative and emotional. But in that book, I talk about melodies and rhythm and tons of different aspects of music, but I don't talk about chords. And I hadn't figured out chords and chord progressions and what they mean. But now I think I understand what they mean, or I'm in the midst of what could be a several-year study. And I've been putting out, though, now videos along the way. So here's what I think it is. And sometimes 2 videos later, I realize that 2 videos earlier, this is not quite right, which is the way it's always going to be. But so they're watching mistakes unfold, but getting closer, nevertheless, towards what might be a solution. So I've been enjoying now for the first time really having my process of discovery kind of out in the public as well.
Good. So where do you go? Or how do you refresh your thoughts in your mind and keep things stimulated?
Where do I go? And yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one thing I don't do is I don't really hang out with academics. I don't really hang out with intellectual types. I hang out with regular folks, CrossFit friends, my friends are. Most of my friends and like all my social buddies, most of them don't know that I'm a scientist. He's some scientist type. They don't know anything about my discoveries. They don't know that I'm doing these COVID stuff. Like they all will sit and argue about COVID and I'll just keep my mouth shut in person. So I'm really outspoken, like internationally, but amongst local crowds, I'll often just sit there and keep my mouth shut as they talk. So, and I think that's just easier. I just like my friends to be just regular. We talk about all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't have to be. When I was young, when I was 20, it's like, hey, I want all my friends to be like, like Noam Chomsky and Hillary Putnam and, these great, it's like Neumann and I want my wife to be, just like, this deep intellectual, and we can talk about, and then I sort of aimed for that with my first marriage, and it never turned out to be that anyway. And I was like, that's not, as I've gotten older and got divorced and remarried, you sort of have a better philosophy of life. I never had a philosophy of life. Now I can say I have the beginnings of sort of a philosophy of life and what it means to live and enjoy life and just enjoy fun and friends and alcohol and exercise and tennis and just fun, enjoyable things. And I didn't really have that before. It was all platonic realms, science and stuff like that. And that's not a life.
So I'm with you on a lot of that. It's a funny thing. A lot of my more intellectual friends have really just kind of herded and schooled in the fish sense of following each other. There hasn't been that much intellectual thought. I kind of am curious whether you think that the masking part was not just about public health, but was a way of stifling people's recognition of each other's absurdity of the situation or perception of absurdity.
I don't think so. I think, and I've talked about this before, like the way that virtue signals work, and it follows a very similar pattern to all of them. The membership signals are what happens first. When you're part of a social community, you start to dress a certain way or wear certain kinds of things that are indicative of that community. And this can even happen like in my old city where I lived, and there were some people in the rich part of town that would, all the ladies who stay-at-home moms, that would all wear like Lululemons. And they're kind of expensive Lululemons. I don't know if that's right, but they're wearing like Lululemon-like gear that they go out with in the daytime and go get their coffee or whatever, sitting with other ladies. Whereas other women in other parts of town, like there was the African-American community, they dress up really nice, right? And each of them, it's an accidental at first signal of membership. It's a membership signal, but it becomes more than that, because over time, each community will have a narrative where they kind of say that it's good itself to have that membership signal. So the Lululemon will be like, well, there's no, it's comfortable, my legs can breathe. And, you know, and the stories that you read in magazines that they read will be like, it's just not good to have high heels and it's really not safe for you. Whereas women in the African-American community or even Persian community where they dress nice and more nice, like, don't you care? Don't you have any self-respect that you don't even want to dress up and just look beautiful? You're walking around like a schlump all day long. It's much better to look like a beautiful person, show respect for it, whatever. They all have these narratives that turn what was just a membership signal and virtuize it, turn it into it's something that itself is inherently virtuous. And this happens unintentionally, right? But people that just sort of come up with ideas, hey, that maybe this is a good idea for why it's good, that will get encouraged, that's selected for. And so over time, and other people, the arguments, anything that's sort of encouraging arguments or justifications for the virtue signal also being good, it's all virtuous, the membership will be encouraged. So it selects for membership signal becoming virtuous. Same thing happened for masks. You know, in March and April of 2020, masks were nowhere. You know, it may be in Asia there were places. No one was wearing them. But that's not quite true. By April, there was a few serious super zero COVID types that would put them on. No one else was wearing them. But then it became clear, okay, that's a good membership signal because the other side's not doing it. It has to be something the other side's not doing. It either has to be sort of arbitrary or irrational or something. And this was pretty irrational, and because anybody who thought about it is like they're just leaking out. But it served as a good membership signal. So soon it became the membership signal by May. But then once it's a membership signal, it invariably selects for, the community selects for arguments for why it's not just a membership signal, but why it's itself good. And so soon the communities came up with, you know, hundreds of observational studies were all bullcrap, right? They're all bullcrap, utter nonsense, justifying why it's in fact virtuous to wear them, right? So I think these are high level, you know, super fancy Harvard level narratives that are moving slowly from membership signal to virtue signal, and it's just those dynamics that are driving it, not science at all. You know, that's really the forces that are involved.
I agree.
As another, this is something that only occurred to me last week. It had, you know, typically when you're involved in tyrannical, authoritarian measures being thrust upon society, the terms that you give for your authoritarian measures are usually euphemisms. It's Orwellian, you know, you don't want to say exactly what it is. It's too harsh, you know, to say the real thing, like health passes for vax passes, right? Vax passes is also not so bad. But what does a health pass or a vax pass means? It means that you're fired from your job. You're banished from society. You can't travel. You may be denied medical care, right? So hidden in this awful tyranny that I just mentioned is just this nice, simple word, health pass, right? But it had been bothering me. I said, well, these kinds of euphemisms, these Orwellianisms, we didn't use those for lockdown or mask. Lockdown and mask are very prison-oriented, right? They just sound like prisoners. I was like, and it kept bothering me for a few weeks. I was like, why did those two terms, did they not come up with a euphemism for it? And then finally it clicked. I said, oh, because you want the euphemisms, the Orwellianisms, so to speak, when you're doing tyrannical things to the unclean out-group. You don't want it when when the righteous members themselves are doing it. You want to emphasize the sacrifice that it takes. You know, it's so hard. I had to mask. I had to lock down. You want it to be not euphemistic. You want it to wear on its sleeve the sacrifice that you're going under, right? And so I think that, I know this is not a cross-comparative study of other kind of, you know, but I would love to be able to look at this across, say that, yeah, when it was stuff that those that were in the righteous group had to endure, there was no euphemistic, you know, naming it something else. They wanted to emphasize how hard it was for them.
That's a good point.
That's what we see here.
I actually think that ties into the Lululemon or the kind of the grunge approach to style. If you graze by TMZ or any of these sites, they'll have some actress out for yoga and coffee or whatever, and then of course they got very loose fitting sweatshirts and so forth. A lot of people who have far less money seem to be enjoying themselves and don't mind the ostentatiousness of presenting, as you mentioned, either in physical clothing appearance or cars or whatever. And there's a lot more enjoyment. There's a definite enjoyment to getting something and having it and loving it. And there's this self-abnegation, self-flagellation that goes on when people have a lot of money. I belong to a tennis club and another tennis club, but and a few other organizations which are skew towards wealthy. And early, this has been going on for quite some time. I kind of like the way Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm drives a tiny little Prius or whatever. He's got $1 billion. He's driving the Prius, and a rapper, rap singer, whatever, it might have a thousandth or a tenth or a hundredth of what Larry David has, but he's going to show it. The baseball player is going to be driving something, pretty swank, and I dare say enjoying himself a little bit more at the same time. It's kind of funny.
Right, and notice that the abnegation crowd will argue to the ends of the earth that what they're doing is utter rationality, and what the other side is doing is totally irrational. And it has nothing to do with that. These are after the fact. This is the other thing about it, by the way. These evolutions from membership signal to virtue signal. Well, the membership signal was already there. The arguments and justifications that it's virtuous or rational or totally a good thing are after the fact. The membership signal hasn't. No one decided this should be the membership signal. It happens typically just by chance. It's one membership signal just ends up growing. And so these are post hoc justifications for these are post hoc justifications. And so you have to just take these things with a grain of salt. And people are unable to recognize that because they're wedded to a community and they're part of it, and the way that we all believe what we believe is by just listening to the high reputation folks around us, right? That's why we all believe what we believe, except for scientists who may have 10 things that they believe because they actually had the data and did the analysis. The rest of the billion things that they believe are because other high reputation people in their community believe them. But the problem is that the way that narratives work is that sometimes the natural dynamics of these communities will end up with selecting for certain kinds of things. And you'll be believing those things because of that dynamics, not because there was an independent judgments from all of these high reputation folks. The only way to avoid it is to truly be aloof. Like it's really to cut these ties, really try to make sure that these people don't have influence on you. And one good way is just to be friends with folks where you're not really, you're just sort of, none of that matters, like they're not impinging on your life, or these are not high reputation folks in terms of what you think in the first place. And I don't know, just that's the way I've tried to live my life.
I think we're going to round out the show in a little bit, but a few things come to mind. One is your thing, aloof. I don't know if you remember when Gary Johnson was running on the Libertarian ticket. He was asked about Aleppo, and he said, "What's Aleppo?" Do you remember that one?
I don't remember that, but it'd be the same. So I be aloof, and then I remember a friend of mine said, "Yeah, loofs of America unite."
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to ask you was, I think you're there's the typical alpha male, the beta, so forth. But I heard recently a lot more Greek letters, just kind of like COVID. There's a sigma, which is, the alpha is kind of like the Gary Cooper, football captain kind of guy that, taller, stronger, possibly silent, that a lot of the betas will follow. But there are a bunch of other ones which are, people who don't engage in society at all, kind of the, say, incel type. And then there's something called sigma, which I thought I might have a little bit of myself, and possibly you as well, which is, we're going to follow our own way. We don't really care about the group, about being the alpha. We don't want to be the beta. We're not betas, but we're going to look at the concept of group and maybe reformulate. It's kind of like we're not in that box. We're thinking outside that box, and we're gonna like wind up making our own story and own narrative. I mean, it's a little bit, my medical career is somewhat like that with, some of the things I've done. We're not going to go into, but just HRT as an example, and other things in that regard that you've been doing. It seems like you are, making your own path in the world. And so here's kind of an inverted question, counterintuitive question to that is whom do you follow? What are the three people you should follow, either on Twitter and what are the three, maybe authors of books that you find inspirational?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, it's been a long time that I'd say that I was inspired in the same way that when you're young, you're inspired, right? So, yeah, when there's a certain age, when I was maybe in college kind of age, that the folks that inspired me were Alan Turing, von Neumann, even Chomsky pre-political. I mean, Chomsky, most people don't know him from that. Chomsky is, the Chomsky hierarchy in theoretical computer science. He's one of the old figures that's part of the sort of foundations of theoretical computer science. Really complicated, rigorous foundations kind of stuff. So Carnap, Quine, Putnam, these are great philosophers, Bertrand Russell. These were the folks that, I read all of their work and really inspired me. And a lot of them have great work that's like von Neumann. There's in biology and complex systems and math, and they were kind of polymaths. So those are the kind of polymaths types that really inspired me. And any inspiration I've had in the last 20 years, I'm 54 now, is going to be a completely different kind of inspiration. You're like, I'm really impressed. It's just, but I think I'm too old to be inspired in the way that you are when you're in college, And then I'm a polymath. That's what I've always aimed, but I'm not really inspirable in the sense of redirectable like I was. I'm probably too crotchety or something to do that, and to have gooey eyes at these kind of people that I want to be like. And so I certainly read a lot in the sense of reading articles and just tons of crazy kinds of different things, but I'm not just sitting down and reading whole books really anymore. I'm just constantly working on new ideas of my own, just 60 or 70 notebooks of just tiny writing, working on trying to come up with the next book, just between doing all these kind of things, just coming up with new ideas. And when I have a new idea, then I read books that are related to that. Mm-hmm. Books I would never read because they're super boring. They're often totally super boring. You would never read them were you not suddenly interested only because you have an idea.
So you're goal oriented, and so you get on a quest and you have to find that thing. I think that's amazing, and I think that's part of the allure. I don't play them, but the next generation or beyond, for me, has a lot of these in-depth games, searching games, and they're working on quests of one type or another. So I think that is evocative and resonates with a lot of the male search for meaning, as it were. I found this fascinating. I'd like to kind of put up your book. I had some technical issues before, so I have to kind of re-find it and present it. But I'd like people to see your webpage and your book. Let me see if I can just find it here quickly. But maybe tell us some closing thoughts and inspiration.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, that's my webpage there. And yeah, that's my sixth book, Expressly Human. You can go to changizi.com and see all my books. It occurred to me, I'll leave on one note, which is a recent science moment, which is the evolution of Satan. It occurred to me that for the first time that why is it that humans invented the devil? And I've been on a long arguments that I've been having over the last few years. I'm trying to understand the kind of evil that we've witnessed over the last 3 years. It's not because there was a group of people who were purposely doing evil by their own lights, right? That's not how crimes against humanity happens. And really what you need to explain societal level evil, which is always these group of righteously motivated people who are doing great harm to the outgroup, right? They're willing to do anything to the outgroup, crush their skulls because they believe, the unclean or evil. To understand that kind of evil is not the kind of thing that we can understand with our everyday intuitions. Like, if Randall, if you want more of my stuff, you steal more of the, your half of the zucchini bread. I don't need a devil to explain why you did that. You want more zucchini bread. So do I. Like, I don't need some to posit anything to understand that. Regular criminal day life is something we all understand because we all have to hold ourselves back because, yeah, I wouldn't mind stealing that or taking more of that. And we're all selfish and greedy in our own ways, and we can have self-control. What we have trouble understanding, though, is when there's like large groups of people who all believe they're doing the right thing, and it's so obvious to us that it's wrong. In fact, they're not even gaining anything. They're often losing money and losing power and hurting the very civilization that they're in, right? But they're doing it because they righteously believe in it, right? These things have happened throughout history, and they will always happen unless we can figure out some ways to better handle it. These are what caused the great genocides and the great democides. And when we encountered this over, history, civilizations encountered these things, and humans were trying to grapple with them, they would be dumbfounded. Why would these people do this and be so evil, but not in an absorbing power kind of way? But they're just doing it because they feel righteously justified to do so. I think that's where it starts to make sense to someone to hypothesize an incorporeal Satan that's whispering into the ears and brainwashing these people. Because that's in fact what if you were where I was in Team Reality watching COVID, every day was yet another absolutely mind-boggling behavior of otherwise rational people, right? It just boggles the mind. And this is what, it boggles all of our minds. And this is, I am trained in the kinds of things that I think one has to do to understand how that kind of evil can happen amongst people who believe they're doing good. But back in the day, no way you're going to understand that, right? And most people today aren't equipped to understand that kind of thing. And so half the people I argue against constantly on Twitter are these people who believe this was all planned by some cabal of people who are doing this to acquire power, to install chips in you, right? That kind of thing. Everybody, that's the kind of explanations that they want, and which is in essence positing a kind of devil, a devil in, that's reality. But the other way is to say that there's a devil whispering in these people's ears, because that's the only way to explain how people that you used to love you would do this, right? So I'm wondering the one theme for why there's these notions of Satan-like figures is because of not just the evil that happens in the world, not criminal-like evil, criminal level evil, but this kind of evil, societal level, mass hysteria kinds of evil. Anyway, we should wrap it up. My batteries are about to die, as you said.
So I'm going to.
It was great to be here. If anybody wants to learn more about my stuff, you can follow me on Twitter, Mark Changizi. I've got a YouTube and Rumble, Science Moment Station, and my new magazine is Loofwired. Loof as in being aloof, but just loofwired.com. I'd like to take down Wired magazine with my more aloof version of it. It's me curating lots and lots of science and political kinds of stories connected to my kind of ideas. So that's.
Well, I love that. I referred people to Changizi.com. This is my little promo. If you'd like to help support my video cast, my podcast, and me in general, and while doing it, help save the world, believe it or not, you can buy my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It comes for the same price with a picture of me on the cover right here. And this is about the pandemic in Brazil, 2015-16. That was, kind of the biggest pandemic to date. Obviously, it's been overshadowed by our current one. It's still important now because right now, as we speak, they're injecting and infecting women in Baltimore with the Zika virus to make a Zika vaccine, whereupon it will no doubt be mandated by the WHO for billions around the world for a problem that doesn't exist. Zika is a real virus. Microcephaly is a real congenital but rare abnormality. It just so happens that one doesn't cause the other, and nobody's backed down from the science part of it. So we see kind of like a lot of the prodrome and a lot of the same characters and same actions that happened during COVID in a different form. So it's kind of a nice, perfect, what I call Fabergé egg of a pandemic, because we're far enough out that we can see that it hasn't recurred and nobody's backed down. So that's its own phenomenon. Maybe one of your next books will be on that, like why humans can never back down.
Yeah, certainly related. Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everybody else, for listening. And please share this liberally. Appreciate it.